this is a good opportunity for us to introduce the panel. Why don't we start with you, Gail?
Sure. I'm Gail Harsma, and I'm the director that is responsible for the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. I work at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I've been working on this Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, 5 of them, as a matter of fact, over the last 12 years.
Wonderful, thank you. Andrew, I know you were a panelist earlier today, but I think this new audience may benefit from hearing from you.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Rosenberg. I'm currently a senior fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. I've worked for government, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the US, in international agencies, in academia, and in non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, in environmental policy, principally ocean policy, as well as the intersection between science and public policy.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And Wendy, I'll welcome you to introduce yourself. Previous moderator, but now competent panelist.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Justin. And really, it's a pleasure to be part of the LIAMforum and this panel. I am the executive director of the Development Partner Institute. We're an organization that's focused on how mining can maximize its contribution to society and to economic well-being, environmental well-being, and social well-being. So I'm going to talk about one of the initiatives that we're working on. And I have a history of nearly more than 30 years in mining and a huge passion for the sector. So I can talk a little bit about that too.
It is great to have you. This is a panel, an important panel, and it is titled Action Now, Sustainability Challenges and Opportunities for Governments, Universities, and Industry. And why do we have this panel? We've spent five days speaking about sustainability, sustainable resource development. We bring to this panel the government of Canada, which has implemented or is trying to implement the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, a very important document. And we want to discuss how do we convert those words into action? What are the challenges we face? Can we, for example, unicorn those ideas? In Silicon Valley, you call a unicorn a company that becomes $1 billion company fairly quickly. How can we get those policies to be adopted quickly, effectively, so the words become action, which is very badly needed? So at the end of the day, after the panel ends, we will have the benefit of the experience of these 3 wonderful individuals. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Gail, ask her to talk about, please speak to us about when and how this federal strategy started to emerge, what her role is, and if she can throw in between the lines, who is she as a person and how come she's doing this? And maybe when she was a young person or an undergraduate, did she ever expect herself to be in this position? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. And I do appreciate the opportunity to fill in, and I will do my best to fill the shoes of Vincent Clausen, who was unfortunately unable to be here today. And maybe I'll just start by saying I come from Noranda, Quebec. That's where I was born and raised. My father worked for Noranda Mines for 45 years. And so I lived in a mining town all my life until I left and went to university. So did I ever expect to be in the federal government working on a federal sustainability strategy? Probably not. That's not what I set out to do in my life. But I'm here to talk a little bit about the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. So this strategy is attached to an act, the Federal Sustainable Development Act, and there are few, if any, countries in the world that have a sustainability act like we do. Wales has a Quality of Life Act, but a Sustainable Development Act, there are very few of them around. This act was brought into effect in 2008. At a time where it was thought that the emphasis on the environment was missing in what was happening in federal government decision making. And so the Federal Sustainable Development Act came into effect. It came in during a minority government, and it was supported by all parties at the time. So very unusual to pass this kind of an act in that kind of a situation at a time in 2008 when the environment was a bit on the back burner at that time. And so this act is very prescriptive, which is quite interesting. It says that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change must release a draft strategy every 3 years for public consultation and then table a final strategy. And so we have this year produced a draft 2022 to 2026 Federal Sustainable Development Strategy that was out for public consultation from March to July. And we are just in the process of tabling the final in Parliament. That should happen in the next month or so. So what is the strategy? There are other things the minister must do. So the minister must also table a progress report against each strategy. And so every 3 years, we have to table a progress report. And our progress reports, which are maybe a little bit different from what you might see in the federal government, track the targets and indicators that are in the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, and we decide whether we're on track or not to meet the targets that are put forward. And it's not easy for government departments to step up and say we're not going to make that target. So it is a bit of an anomaly. Ministers are responsible for the targets that are in the strategy, and our act was amended, and those amendments came into effect in 2000, just 2 years ago, so in 2020. And we now have to have targets that are measurable, have a time frame, and have indicators to track them. So this current strategy that we're looking at has almost 50 targets. And it has a whole of government reporting where 101 federal organizations are now implicated by the act, and that is also new. And it has 99 indicators to track progress. And I know that sounds like a lot, but we have 54 target indicators to track the targets and 45 that provide contextual indicators. What we have heard in our public consultation is the importance of being able to track progress against targets. It's not good enough to have open-ended targets. It's not good enough to have indicators that may not match your targets. We have been asked time and time again to make sure that our targets are very clear, that they are measurable, have a time frame, and have appropriate indicators to track progress. We're audited by the Auditor General's office, the Auditor General of Canada, during public consultations, and they do talk about our targets and give us feedback so that we can make changes between the draft and the final. So I don't know how much you want to know about the strategy, but I can tell you that we have used the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as the frame for this strategy, and this is a first for us. And so we have social, economic, and environmental targets. More environmental targets than social and economic, because this started as an environmental strategy. That's why it sits at the Department of the Environment. But the amendments that came into effect a couple of years ago broadened that view from the environment to sustainable development writ large. So it's made a few changes to the way in which we deliver the strategy. So we have a brand new strategy that is being tabled in the next month. So we have targets that are around poverty. We have targets that are around greenhouse gas emission reduction. We have targets about access to broadband. There's the realm biodiversity targets, so it's the realm of sustainable development. Also, we have a chapter that is dedicated to affordable and clean energy, and certainly one that deals with waste as well, that has a bit of a mining over to it. And The strength of this strategy is that it brings together in one place the major government of Canada priorities around sustainable development. And it brings it together in a way that shows you what the government of Canada has as a target, what is it's expecting and how it's going to get there, what its contribution is. But as you mentioned, Raziel, that we have a number of targets that the government of Canada cannot do alone. Greenhouse gas emission reduction, the federal government doesn't own greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Everybody does. And so everyone does have a part to play. We track and monitor progress. We have state of the environment indicators that tell us whether greenhouse gas emissions are going up or down. But everyone does have a part to play in this strategy. So maybe I'll wrap it up about the strategy, but I'll say a couple of things. What kinds of skills do you need to have to work in this kind of a field? Well, you need to be able to negotiate, and you need to be able to negotiate with 101 federal departments that may not necessarily want to give you the information that you're looking for in a way that you need it. And so that is a skill that's invaluable. You also need to be able to write very well and very quickly. Take a lot of information, boil it down to the main points, get those points on paper, and move things forward. So my background is actually in communications and in engagement. And so I worked in that field in the private sector for many years before I joined the government. But those kinds of skills feature well when you're trying to take something that is more scientific, more policy oriented, and trying to make it understandable to Canadians. And you need to understand data and how to measure progress. So vast kinds of skills, and do public consultations. Speak well, answer questions, be able to relate to people. I've taught university classes on this particular strategy and heard feedback from university students across the country. And so there are many different kinds of skills that you can bring to the table to have this kind of a role in bringing together such a large document that's very important to the government of Canada.
Gail, thank you very much. I'll have a couple of questions, but I want to give the floor to Wendy, and then we will, because they apply to both. So Wendy, if you could please give us a background as to what you've been doing in RESCO and so on, and then we will. I'll give the floor to Andrew, and my questions will be after all three of you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Raziel. And it's really interesting, Gail, to hear your story of what you're working on in Canada with the federal government. That's wonderful and leading the way for much of the world, I would suggest. So really interesting. So Raziel, your question initially was, did I think I'd be here? So I grew up on a property where we produced cattle in Queensland in Australia. And we always had an interest in our position in the global market, because with agriculture, like mining, there's a connection between what we do and the weather, and a connection with the environment and community, and also a connection to the global marketplace. So I've always had that interest. And I kind of accidentally fell into mining, but loved it from the beginning and saw what an amazing industry it is. Both are primary industries. Everything that we have in our world is either grown or mined. So it felt very natural to me. But did I expect that I would be running a global organization that's focused on furthering and advancing the mining sector? No, I didn't. So yeah, it's an honor to be here. And so the Development Partner Institute is an organization that sees that complex challenges require collaboration and innovation in order to be solved. No one industry, no one person is going to be able to solve the complex challenges that we face alone. So we're focused on accelerating a new future for mining. And as part of that, we recently launched an initiative which we call our Responsible Sourcing Coalition, or RESCO for short. That's our little name for it, RESCO. And it's focused on accelerating a minerals and precious gems value chain that is free from structural inequality, shaped by community values, and really importantly for mining, moves from a mindset of risk management to one of long-term value creation for all stakeholders. We began this journey in 2019 in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, a global development organization. And we started with an in-person conversation with many stakeholders from across many different types of stakeholders from across the value chain. So a small group, but very diverse group. And that was at the Bellagio Center. And then in 2020 and 2021, like everyone, we were constrained. We held virtual working sessions, and we collectively landed that one of the most important things that was missing was a unifying vision for the future of responsible sourcing. And this was seen as a significant gap as standards continued to evolve. And we know that consumer-facing companies with relationships to mining are inherently diverse. They include automakers, they include renewable energy providers, jewelry, construction, very wide range. And in these varied sectors, calls are intensifying for visibility and responsible sourcing of their products, of the minerals and materials that go into their products to satisfy market demands. So there are wildly varying views of what constitutes the right way forward and what responsible sourcing means. And there are different timeframes. So there are companies that report quarter by quarter. And then there are, at the other end of the spectrum, there are Indigenous peoples who think 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So the timeframes, the scales, the thinking, very different. And we wanted to creatively paint a picture of where we could be in 2040, both globally and locally. So our role being to create and facilitate a multi-stakeholder understanding and alignment. So we held 2 regional virtual dialogues, one in Australia, one in Peru. And then we followed that up last week with an in-person session in London, and here where I am at the moment in London. And it's about developing new relationships. It's about forging deeper understanding. It's about exploring new innovative ideas and contributing to long-term value for stakeholders. So we've created a vision. It's being developed at the moment. And we created 4 exciting areas that we are looking at to work on. So the first is creating a marketplace for ideas and knowledge sharing. So a digital marketplace. We've got another stream of work that's developing around co-creating to drive net societal value. How do we do that at a community level to bring different stakeholders together? Creating a structurally equitable mineral value chain. And fourthly, communicating and propagating the ideas around responsible sourcing, because even in the LIAMforum, I'm sure there will be many people that have not, prior to coming to the LIAMforum, have not heard about the ideas of responsible sourcing. So we want to build those ideas out into the world. So if I could just finish by saying that we love others to join us in this journey of the Responsible Sourcing Coalition and the Development Partner Institute. So if people want to, they can find me on LinkedIn, and that's the best way to reach me. Send me a message on LinkedIn, reach out and join us in our journey. Thanks, Raziel.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for that very good summary. Andrew, what I want to ask you is the following. You live in the United States, a great country, which has undertaken initiatives. To give an example, is a Foreign Practices Corrupt Act that has set the standards decades ahead of the rest of the world in passing long visionary legislation. The FDA decades ago in the States started doing things. In your view, what is your view on the Canadian federal government's initiative regarding sustainability? If you were advising the government, what lessons from the US experience and from your own personal international experience would you give them in terms of enhancing the rolling out and the implementation of the strategy?
So thank you, Raziel, and thank you for the question and for the invitation. I'm going to take my time to partially answer your question, but also more directly address the role that I think various sectors should be playing in sustainability a little more broadly. So to be fair, I know absolutely nothing about mining other than it exists. A fair amount about environmental policy and certainly ocean science and some other environmental science. I had no idea that that's where I would be working. I was interested in working on the ocean because I like boats. There's one behind me in this picture that I built a couple of years ago as my pandemic project. But I didn't have any sense that I would work on sustainability, ultimately work for government, even work for fisheries when I was initially. I didn't go to university right away out of school, but a few years later when I did go to university, I had no sense of what my career path would be, and I'd have to say it's changed a lot in many places. I say this because having experience in government and university sector as a faculty member and in a couple of different universities, in non-governmental public interest organizations, environmental organizations as they're usually known, and sometimes working with industry, although not the mining industry. I've always been interested in the roles that different organizations play and that the people in those organizations play. So I think the Canadian government strategy is cutting edge, Gail. I think there, as you say, there's very few that are trying to articulate a sustainability strategy on such a comprehensive and wide basis. I mean, there are some EU states like Denmark that have done significant work in this area. There are other efforts around the world that are in parallel, but I don't necessarily think as comprehensive. It's extraordinarily difficult to do that government work. I agree with all of the skills that you outlined, and I've observed their use and sometimes misuse over the last 35 years. It's it's interesting to me that if you have a primary relationship between government ministries, departments in the US, and by the way, I was educated in Canada, so I've sort of straddled various systems. If you have an interaction between government and industry and very few others who are led into that interaction, which is often the case in the US and sometimes has been historically the case in most other developed nations, then you end up with a set of, I would say, weak policies, because it's quite easy for industry to virtually capture government. It's a well-known phenomenon of agency capture, where most of the people who are working in government work with they have the same training as people working in industry. That's an easy communication. Industry has very powerful ability to put their case forward. Disrupting that relationship is incredibly important. So what disrupts the relationship? The relationship between government and industry. Of course, government is always interested in economic growth, economic development, jobs, etc. What disrupts that, just let industry essentially have their way, are First Nations, who have pre-existing and legally astonishingly powerful claims, particularly to natural resources, but to many other challenges. In the US, the tribes. Non-governmental public interest organizations that can marshal a lot of constituent power to speak out and drive an agenda towards sustainability, can call on the industry groups and others that Wendy works with to open up that process and not essentially say, well, don't worry, we'll just take care of it, which is, of course, the pattern over many decades, which resulted in a lot of extremely unsustainable and inequitable practices. And in many cases, science. So sometimes the science, if presented correctly and independently from either the government or industry, can be extremely powerful in changing direction. So I say all that because I hope that all I see is the other speakers on the screen and then a black background, and I have no idea who is in the audience right now, but I'm hoping that people think that there is a role they can play. Working for government can be incredibly rewarding and astonishingly difficult in my experience, and I did it for 13 years on ocean management, and I was proud of some things that I accomplished, and I know a lot of things that I should have accomplished and couldn't, because you are working in the public interest, but every individual in that public believes, well, you're not doing what I want you to do, therefore you're not working in the public interest. Working in a university sector, you can be incredibly removed from what's going on, but you also have the freedom to explore ideas that other people don't. The question is whether you're willing to bring those ideas forward into a serious policy environment. Working in industry, you can make real change because you have resources that, frankly, nobody else has, and nobody else ever will have except for industry. But you're in a constrained environment, which doesn't necessarily allow you to pursue some things. And then working in public interest organizations, which I've been doing for the last 12 years, is you can, at least the organization can say whatever it wants, but it doesn't have accountability for putting it into action. So you're out there on the side saying, hey, over here, you should do this, you should do this, but you don't actually have to do it. It's only government that has to do it, and sometimes industry. Everybody else is an advisor. And so all of those roles are really important, but the most important thing is that each of the roles have as much equality in their strength as possible. So while I think the strategy is really good, if the people of Canada and the people of First Nations and other countries, the public in other countries don't put as much pressure as possible on to take the actions that they want to see, whether it be on climate change, on sustainability broadly, or on equity. And if I had to describe the greatest challenges facing us, they would be sustainability, which is inclusive of climate change. It's now sustainability in a changing environment. And dealing with massive inequity globally, nationally, locally, that occurs in every place that I've ever, of the maybe 40 countries that I've, had an opportunity to visit and work in. Every single one is struggling with massive inequity that is not inherent. It's not, it's created by society. And I don't believe that you will have a sustainable future without addressing inequity. I don't believe you'll have a sustainable future without engaging all the sectors that I just talked about. And of course you won't unless we come to grips with climate change. And so finally, I just say that, bad things happen when people of good intent stay silent, is a paraphrasing a misattributed quote to Edmund Burke. But, you can sit back and say somebody really should do something about that, but, it's not somebody else's problem. And so for anyone who's thinking about where they fit, there is a critically important role that could be in government, that could be in industry, that could be in NGOs, that could be in universities, and could be in community organizations. Everybody doesn't fit each one of those roles, and so that's the decision that you have to make. And you don't have to stay in only one place. And so I think I just described that I worked in 4 of those areas, community organizations I have worked with, but not as a part of. And so, there is a role, whether your concern is about social equity and justice, about climate change, about environmental policy, or about industry growth and profitability. None of those things at any point can be divorced from a concept of sustainability as articulated in the plan that Gail laid out. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I want to go straight into the points I want to make. And a challenge for Gail and for Wendy and also for Andrew. Gail mentioned she needs to influence 101 Dalmatians or government organizations. Right, and which is not going to be an easy task. So that is something from the top down, just within the silo of the federal government. Is it possible that this being the LIAMforum, where we're speaking to young people, can young people become the agents of change and force each of those 101 organizations to listen up, to actually realize that there's a groundswell of support, of interest in actually seeing sustainability becoming reality? So how could your office, Gail, involve young people? I know you've consulted. If you search within your document, there's many references to youth. Have you consulted youth extensively? But have you considered mobilizing youth to support this? On another panel, a young undergraduate from the University of Waterloo is proposing a mandatory sustainability basic course for everybody, like a first aid course equivalent on sustainability. So we develop a common vocabulary, so we understand what the goals, aspirations, and language is. So that is one question for you. And the parallel for Wendy, in the minerals industry, you have supply chains, and increasingly it is the large car companies, the large manufacturers who want to see transparency in the supply chains. They want to know that a pound of copper that goes into a car doesn't carry a large carbon footprint. That is that. So there is a concept of green steel today, that Sweden is starting to produce steel that has zero carbon or positive carbon impact. So these are movements that are happening, and I very much like Andrew's mention of equity. Inequity and lack of sustainability go hand in hand. You cannot achieve this progress unless we address those issues. These are systemic issues. They're big challenges. No one person has the solution, but young people, it is their world, and 10, 20, 30 years from now, they will be in charge. And we want, as Andrew says, young people should contemplate doing this, because although you don't think you may have a large influence now, because we were all that age at some point, your enthusiasm and your values will get you there. Your voice will be heard. And you don't have to write a huge document like the one Gail's been in charge. Short position papers, like 2-3 page papers, such as the one generated at Waterloo, they get the ball rolling. So with that, I'm gonna give Gail the microphone. We have about 12 minutes left, or thereabouts, 13 minutes. If she could speak for 2 or 3 minutes, then Wendy, and then back to Andrew.
So I'll talk about a couple of things. One of the things that the Act, our Federal Sustainable Development Strategy Act, lays out is that the minister has a Sustainable Development Advisory Council. And that council is made up of 28 members, and that's representatives who are regular individuals from every province and territory across the country, as well as representatives from business, labor, environmental organizations, and Indigenous peoples. And we have, as the Sustainable Development Office at Environment and Climate Change Canada, we have made sure that we have a mix of backgrounds, representatives, and ages of people on that council. And so it's very interesting to have people who have been in business for 30 years talking to the recent graduate from Kenora, an Indigenous young man who speaks with his reality and his situation. And so we have that kind of a council who meets with the minister and advises him on the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. So we have that. We also, at the Environment and Climate Change Canada, have a youth council that is made up of young people. And so for anyone out there who's listening, if you don't think your voice is important, think again. It's critically important. One of the principles that we added to the amended Act is the principle of intergenerational equity. Very important that the decisions that we're making now will affect generations to come. And so it's important to step up and speak out now so that you will have that influence. Climate change is the biggest issue that the globe is dealing with, and it's time to get involved and to speak out. We have heard also in public consultations that people don't understand climate change and don't understand climate literacy. It's very low, and we have been pushed as a government to do something about that, to put some curriculum together, and I understand some of that's being worked on. But we have definitely heard that if you want to have people who have something to say, they need to understand the issues. And so definitely heard loud and clear about that. We also heard from youth that green jobs are important. And so training in that area needs to be clear. What do you mean by green jobs? What does that mean to me as an individual? And how can I take training that will get me one of those green jobs? So lots of things going on, lots of opportunities to speak out and to have your voice heard in forums that are very influential. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Gail. Wendy, do you want to respond to the points I made?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raziel. I wholeheartedly agree with Gail in that the opportunity for young people is now, and the voice of young people has often, when we think about the mining value chain, the voices of young people, of Indigenous peoples, and of women have historically not had a big place in the mining value chain. And that is changing. And I interviewed for the piece of work that I spoke about, RESCO, The Future is X 2040. I interviewed young people, and in Australia, I asked young people about what's important for them, and it was they so beautifully articulated the opportunities, the role for mining, the way that it can be undertaken in a different way so that it is creating structural equality in the mining value chain. So it is addressing climate change. Such clear perspectives. And as people that are definitely no longer considered to be young, we need to hear those voices, and we need to hear the voices of Indigenous people. We need to hear the voices of women. If I think about Africa, the 54 countries in Africa, I think about 70% of people are under 30. Young people are going to rule the world. And it's very interesting to hear Gail say that climate change is not well understood. My sense is that young people understand climate change, what it means, what the implications are. And so in our roles, we've got such a wonderful opportunity to harness those voices and to bring them to the table and to bring the thinking and the new ideas into our work. I'm excited by that. I'm inspired by what young people have to say and have to offer. I'll leave it there, Raziel.
So, thank you. When listening to you and listening to your voices, my next point will be to Andrew. I think young people think policies is something for old people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that we make room for them, and that is wrong. We need to convey. I started in the panel using the word unicorn. How do we empower young people, convince young people that this is for them, and we want them? We want to give them the steering wheel, and we want them to realize they will be in charge in 1 year, in 2 years, certainly in 10 years. So they might as well start training how to run the show. So what would you say, Andrew? How do you get a large segment of the population, the young people, to embrace these ideas? In oceans, for example, in fisheries, I think you would have, my guess, you would have a much more acceptance from young people to the things that you care about in terms of appreciating the policies. If you had a chance to get on a microphone when you were in those policy positions and speak to university and high school students across the country or across the world, I think many of them would instinctively say, yes, that makes sense, let's make it happen. How can we convey that to today's youth or today's era? How can we make policies more translatable, more embraceable? Andrew.
Yeah. So first of all, I would quibble a little bit with your wording. I don't think that it is a matter for us to give power to younger generations. I think it's for them to take it. I wouldn't wait. And nobody's going to mistake me for being young, but I just don't think waiting for somebody to hand you the reins is the metaphor that we should use. I think that change is a constant, but not the rate of change. And we're at an inflection point in the way that society needs to change in dealing with issues of sustainability, but effectively dealing with the role of environment in our society, in our economy, in social equity, and so on. From the perspective of now, somebody who's, old and broken down and whatever, I think one of the important things to do is to get out of the way. In other words, it really bothers me when politicians and others, will stay on and on and on and not make room for somebody else to take a try at doing a job because we all feel that we're so important. I don't feel that that's the case, but I don't think anyone in younger generations should think, well, I have to wait until somebody gives me permission to take a stronger role in this world that we're either, in this world that we live in and sometimes messing up. I think that Gail and to some extent Wendy both talked about the sort of formal structures that have been set up for receiving input from youth, from communities, from different peoples, and all of those are very important. And it is important for people to step forward and say, I could be part of that. But also every person in Canada is a constituent of, they have local representatives, they have provincial representatives, they have federal representatives. And most people say, well, they're not going to listen to me. Well, they certainly won't listen to you if you don't speak up. They certainly won't listen to you if you're not engaged. So that's a given. You need to make it very hard to only listen to a few voices. Now, I can say with great confidence that the evidence is that the politics in the US is even more messed up than most other places. But constituency here still matters as well. What allows some of the bad things to happen that have happened in US politics and in other countries is letting go of your ability to have a voice and accepting that you can be pushed to the background. That's the road to an autocracy. And some countries have already followed that road, and we have been on the precipice of it in the US, I think, and still, I suppose we are. But that requires some level of acceptance or some level of passivity. And I just can't imagine that many youth think that, that's an acceptable road to go down. Every channel to provide input on a sustainability plan is not a formal channel set up by the government. There's lots of things happening where people are saying, hey, you need to listen to me too. And those aren't, when I was in government, I didn't view those negatively. I viewed those as, thank goodness someone is speaking out, because it provides back pressure to the other loud voices. And it's the only way. That's what I'm saying. You need to disrupt what is a tight relationship. There's some people who, I was dealing with fishermen. Fishermen can be pretty tough. I bet miners can be too. And their voices can be pretty loud and they can be intimidating. And a few very brave people from non-governmental or from environmental organizations would come to the meetings, would get in the room, would demand to get to the microphone, would speak out with knowledgeable. I don't just mean carrying signs in the street or saying, performative actions in demonstrations, but they would go to every meeting, and I was taking abuse as the government representative, and they were taking a fair, because people didn't want them in the room. They were disrupting the relationship. And so, if I had to say, to a young person, one thing you ought to think about as you're building your career is be a disruptor. Whether that's with your voice or whether that's with your work as a scientist or as a writer or as a policymaker or as an artist, whatever it is, be a disruptor. Because you can't sort of happily march down a path that we're on now, which is not all bad. I'm not saying everything is, off track, but the only way to change the power dynamic is to get in and try to change it, whether that's working with a local community organization or working, within a political system or outside it. All of those things are necessary.
I want to add that the current Minister of the Environment was arrested as a younger man because he was an activist for Greenpeace. And now he finds himself, maybe much to his surprise, as a Minister of the Environment, and he's trying to push through. And you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean you do things without thought, but it is important. And I'm going to put this on the table, perhaps for Gail. Gail, would there be value? We organized this conference without a budget, just with volunteers. And it has been listened to in 59 countries at the last count. Could we do something that we involve all colleges across Canada, all high schools, and have a video conference and discuss with them and prepare a little booklet or electronic pamphlet explaining the basis of what we're trying to accomplish, and also consult youth? I'll be very happy to put you in touch with these undergraduates from Waterloo, for example, to reach out to you?
I'm happy to talk with any students. I've gone to Waterloo and taught their sustainability course as a guest lecturer. Happy to talk to youth at any time about sustainable development. It's definitely a passion of mine. I've worked in this field now for 12 years. And I will tell you that I hire students, at least 3 students every term, because I want to be sure that we're hearing from new, smart, young people with great ideas. And I think they go away learning things, and we also benefit from having them. And we hire them, you know, down the road. So that's how we feed into what it is we're doing. We kind of talk about the federal sustainable development strategies being like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can really never leave. We want to make you ambassadors of sustainable development when you spend some time with us. But we are open certainly to, we do public webinars all the time. And so we are happy to be able to speak to people at any juncture who want to talk about sustainability. So yeah, certainly open to that.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to wrap up. Wendy, did you have some final words for about 20 seconds, and then Andrew, and then we'll wrap it up.
Just thank you. And the one thing that's on my mind, I said it on a previous panel, is we have to stop thinking that we have all the answers and allow the space for others to create new ideas and new opportunities. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of what you've created, Raziel, and in honor of your son. And yes, it's a great honor for us. So thank you.
Thank you. And Andrew?
Well, I certainly would thank you. I think I probably said as many times as I can, you know, that I want people to be involved. I think that, you know, there are so many avenues for people to, you know, to actually step forward and start working on a set of issues. And it's not like there's one path, or that you need to be stuck on that path. You know, I had a, you know, more or less traditional training in science, moved into policy, moved back into science, was in university, was in government, you know, was in non-government organizations, worked in international organizations. People sometimes feel like, oh, well, I have to decide, do I want to work for government, or do I want to work in the university sector, or do I want to go into industry? And I guess the one thing I'd say is you can make that decision for a period of time. Okay, for the next 5 years, what do I want to do? Or for the next 2 years, or whatever it might be. You know, the style of having a career where you're placed in one place, one sector, or doing one thing, that might have been true for my generation, our generation. That is no longer the way people's careers go. You have much more flexibility and much more opportunity, so use it.
Thank you very much. I want to thank each of you for your time, for your comments. And so with that, I'll wrap up. This is, I think, the final panel. We have a final session in the LIAMforum where we discuss what we have achieved and where do we want to go from there. So with those words, I want to again thank you, and we'll close this panel down. Thank you very much.